You just threw away the only engine that could change this company forever." Nobody in the garage paid attention when Marcus Brooks said those words. They were too busy watching Claire Whitmore fold her arms, shake her head, and point toward the exit with the calm confidence of someone who had never doubted her own decisions. The cavernous performance shop echoed with the hum of fluorescent lights, the metallic clink of cooling tools, and the low murmur of mechanics pretending not to stare. In the center of it all sat an old V8 engine covered in grease, faded paint, and decades of disappointment. Every senior engineer had already signed off on the same conclusion. It was finished, cracked beyond reason, too expensive to rebuild, worth more as scrap than as machinery. Marcus had spent 3 straight nights studying every bolt, every cylinder wall, every scar left by time. While everyone else saw a dead engine, he saw a mistake hidden inside a forgotten design. "You're wasting company time," Claire said, her voice steady enough to silence the room. "We've invested thousands of dollars chasing your theory. It's over." Marcus slowly removed his work gloves without arguing. He looked at the engine one last time, not with regret, but with quiet certainty. "It's not over," he replied. "It hasn't even started." A few mechanics exchanged amused smiles. Someone whispered that the old guy had finally lost it. Another laughed under his breath. Claire didn't. She simply held out the termination papers. Effective immediately. Marcus accepted them with both hands. No anger crossed his face. No desperate explanation followed. He thanked her for the opportunity, gathered a weathered toolbox that looked older than some of the employees standing there, and rolled the forgotten engine toward the loading dock. The afternoon sunlight spilled across the concrete as he carefully loaded every piece into the back of his aging pickup truck. The engine looked like nothing more than a pile of rust to anyone passing by. To Marcus, it looked like a promise. As he climbed behind the wheel, his phone buzzed with a text from his 12-year-old daughter, Ava. "Did today go okay, Dad?" He smiled before typing only 4 words. "Better than they think." Miles away, Claire walked into the executive conference room, convinced she had protected her company from an expensive mistake. She had no way of knowing that the quiet man she had just fired wasn't walking away from failure. He was driving home with the future of American motorsports resting in the bed of a 20-year-old pickup truck. Marcus Brooks lived 23 miles outside the city, where the highways gave way to quiet county roads lined with weathered fences and old oak trees that had stood longer than most memories. His small detached garage sat behind a modest white house with peeling paint, a creaking porch swing, and flower beds that had not been planted for appearance but because his late wife had loved them. Every evening, the scent of motor oil drifted through the open garage doors, blending with fresh-cut grass and the faint aroma of dinner floating from nearby homes. To Marcus, it smelled like another chance. Ava was already waiting on the porch when his pickup rolled into the driveway. She noticed the heavy engine in the truck bed before he even shut off the ignition. Her eyes widened with curiosity instead of concern. She had grown up around engines the way other children grew up around baseball gloves or bicycles. She hurried down the porch steps carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "Did they finally let you bring it home?" she asked. Marcus smiled gently as he accepted the glass. "Something like that." She studied his face for a long moment. "They fired you?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes." Ava looked toward the old engine again. "Are you sad?" He rested one hand against the cool metal block. "No. Sometimes people only see what something used to be. My job is to see what it can still become." She thought about that answer before quietly helping him unload the engine piece by piece. Neither of them rushed. Every bolt, every bracket, every worn component was placed neatly onto shelves inside the garage, as if they were handling family heirlooms instead of discarded machinery. The workshop itself reflected the man who owned it. Every wrench hung in perfect order. Every socket had its place. A faded American flag rested above an old wooden workbench scarred by years of honest labor. Framed photographs lined one wall. One showed Marcus standing beside a race car many years earlier. Another captured him holding a much younger Ava while both smiled beneath fireworks on the 4th of July, and between them sat a small picture of his wife, Emily, whose smile seemed to brighten the room even after all these years. Marcus reached into a cabinet and removed a leather notebook filled with handwritten sketches, measurements, and equations. Ava recognized it immediately. "Mom called that your impossible book," she said softly. Marcus laughed under his breath. "She also said impossible usually meant I had not finished thinking yet." As the evening sun filtered through dusty windows, he carefully measured the cracked engine block again. His fingers paused over one nearly invisible flaw, hidden beneath years of carbon buildup. Every engineer at Whitmore Velocity had examined the obvious damage. Nobody had searched for the tiny manufacturing defect that had quietly robbed the engine of its true potential since the day it had first left the assembly line. Marcus circled the flaw with a yellow grease pencil and stepped back. His breathing slowed. His eyes grew calm. He was no longer looking at a failed machine. He was looking at an answer waiting patiently for someone willing to listen. Inside the house, Ava switched on the kitchen light and began preparing grilled cheese sandwiches just as her mother had taught her years before. She glanced through the window toward the garage where her father remained perfectly still, studying silent metal as though it could speak. She had seen that look only a handful of times in her life. Whenever it appeared, something extraordinary usually followed. The next morning arrived with a cool breeze drifting through the open garage doors as sunlight settled across the concrete floor in long golden lines. Marcus had already been awake for 3 hours. Coffee steamed quietly beside the workbench while pages from his leather notebook lay open beneath a small desk lamp that was no longer needed but had not yet been switched off. Ava stepped into the garage wearing her school backpack and stopped when she noticed dozens of careful measurements covering a large sheet of paper. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. Marcus smiled without looking up. "Enough." She laughed because she knew that answer always meant almost none. Before leaving for school, she placed a small folded note beside his coffee mug. "For good luck," she said. Marcus waited until her school bus disappeared down the road before unfolding the paper. Inside, written in careful handwriting, were 6 simple words. "People quit. You never do, Dad." He slipped the note into his shirt pocket and returned to the engine with renewed focus. Hours passed in complete silence except for the ticking of precision tools, the soft scrape of measuring gauges, and the distant songs of birds outside the garage. Piece by piece, Marcus cleaned decades of carbon deposits from the engine block until an almost invisible casting line emerged beneath the grime. He stopped immediately. His fingers traced the line while his eyes narrowed. It was not damage. It was evidence. A manufacturing variation less than the thickness of a credit card had altered the airflow through the engine since the day it was built. Every repair shop had treated the symptoms. Nobody had discovered the true cause. Marcus slowly leaned back in his chair. "There you are," he whispered. His phone rang across the workbench. The caller identification displayed the name Ethan Walker, an old friend who had once tested prototype race cars for several manufacturers before retiring from professional competition. Marcus answered with a quiet greeting. Ethan wasted no time. "I heard what happened yesterday." Marcus simply replied, "News travels fast." Ethan sighed. "Claire made a mistake." Marcus looked toward the engine. "Maybe she made the decision she believed was right." "That sounds like forgiveness." Marcus smiled faintly. "No. That sounds like experience." Ethan paused before asking the question that mattered. "Tell me honestly, is that old engine worth saving?" Marcus looked at the exposed casting line one more time. "It has never had the chance to become what it was designed to be." Silence filled the call for several seconds. Finally, Ethan laughed softly. "I know that voice. You found something." Marcus did not answer directly. "If I asked you to test it when it is finished, would you?" Ethan responded without hesitation. "Tomorrow, next month, next year, whenever you call." Across town, Whitmore Velocity prepared for an important presentation with investors. Claire stood inside the engineering lab reviewing performance reports from the company's newest engine platform. One after another, the numbers disappointed her. Efficiency remained below projections. Cooling problems persisted. Reliability targets continued slipping farther away. Senior engineers offered new explanations, new budgets, and new deadlines, but none offered confidence. Claire quietly stared through the conference room window toward the empty workstation where Marcus had spent countless evenings working long after everyone else had gone home. For the first time since signing his termination papers, an unfamiliar thought entered her mind. What if the only person who truly understood engines was the one she had asked to leave? 3 days passed with little sleep and even less conversation. The quiet garage became a world of its own where every hour was measured not by clocks but by progress. The scent of machine oil mixed with fresh coffee, while soft jazz drifted from an old radio sitting on a dusty shelf. Marcus worked with steady hands and patient eyes, never rushing a single measurement. He replaced nothing unless it truly needed replacing. He believed every well-made part deserved the chance to finish the job it had started decades earlier. Late each afternoon, Ava returned from school and found him exactly where she expected, standing over the engine with a pencil tucked behind one ear and grease across his hands. She never interrupted his concentration. Instead, she quietly swept the floor, organized tools, and read aloud from her science homework while he listened. "Did you ever think about giving up?" she asked one evening as she tightened labels onto small storage bins. Marcus looked up from the cylinder head and smiled gently. "Every honest person thinks about giving up." She tilted her head. "Then why did you not?" He rested both hands on the workbench before answering. "Because quitting and resting are not the same thing. Sometimes you stop to breathe. You never stop believing." Ava nodded as if storing the lesson beside every other piece of wisdom her father had quietly given her over the years. The following morning, Marcus loaded several carefully machined components into his pickup and drove across town to a family-owned machine shop operated by Harold Jensen, a gray-haired craftsman who had known Marcus for nearly 20 years. Harold inspected each part beneath bright inspection lights before slowly removing his glasses. "Whoever designed this originally was thinking 10 years ahead of everyone else," he said. Marcus replied softly, They just missed one detail." Harold studied the revised specifications Marcus had drawn by hand. "You are changing airflow without changing displacement." Marcus nodded. "Exactly." Harold looked at him for another long moment before smiling. "Most engineers would have replaced the engine. You are teaching it how to breathe." Marcus simply answered, "Machines are a lot like people." Harold laughed warmly. "You always did talk about engines like they had souls." By the end of the week, the final components returned to Marcus's garage. One by one, he assembled the engine with the patience of a watchmaker restoring a family heirloom. Every bolt received the exact torque. Every clearance was checked twice. Every moving surface was polished until it reflected the workshop lights. As sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and deep blue, Marcus stepped back from the completed engine. It looked almost unchanged to an ordinary eye. There were no flashy colors, no oversized parts, no unnecessary decoration. Its greatest difference remained hidden inside where no camera or casual observer would ever notice. Ava walked into the garage carrying 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She followed her father's gaze toward the finished engine. "Is it ready?" she asked. Marcus took a slow breath before answering. "It is ready to tell the truth." At that very moment, across the city, Whitmore Velocity gathered for another performance review. Engineers projected charts across a large conference room wall while investors listened with growing concern. Prototype after prototype continued falling short of expectations. Claire remained composed, but the confidence that once filled every decision had begun to fade. As another disappointing report landed on the conference table, she glanced once more toward the empty chair where Marcus had spent years solving problems that everyone else believed impossible. This time she did not see an empty workspace. She saw a question she could no longer ignore. Saturday arrived beneath a cloudless sky, and the abandoned airfield outside Millhaven had become the kind of quiet place where forgotten dreams often found room to breathe again. The cracked runway stretched nearly 2 miles across open farmland, its faded centerline still visible beneath years of sun and rain. Ethan Walker stood beside a silver test chassis balanced on racing slicks, sipping black coffee while watching Marcus carefully lower the rebuilt engine into place with an aging chain hoist. Neither man hurried. Neither spoke much. The only sounds came from the gentle breeze crossing the empty runway and the occasional click of a wrench settling into place. Ethan finally broke the silence. You know, every manufacturer in the country says this design reached its limit 20 years ago. Marcus tightened the final mounting bolt before answering. Limits are often measurements of imagination. Ethan smiled because that sounded exactly like the Marcus he remembered from years earlier, the engineer who could spend 12 hours solving a problem everyone else dismissed in 12 minutes. As the final electrical connection snapped into place, Marcus reached into his shirt pocket and unfolded Ava's small handwritten note. He read the 6 words one more time before placing the paper carefully inside the glove compartment of the test car. Ethan noticed but asked no questions. Some things deserved privacy. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat while Ethan connected diagnostic equipment to monitor temperatures, airflow, fuel pressure, and combustion. Timing. Every display illuminated one after another until the screen settled into perfect readiness. Ethan looked through the open window. Whenever you are. Marcus rested one hand on the steering wheel and gently turned the ignition. For a brief moment nothing happened. Then the engine awakened with a deep, smooth rumble unlike anything Ethan had expected. There was no violent roar, no dramatic explosion of sound. Instead, it idled with remarkable balance, every cylinder working in quiet harmony as though decades of waiting had finally ended. Ethan stared at the live data scrolling across the monitor. Oil pressure remained perfect. Temperatures stabilized faster than any comparable engine he had ever tested. Airflow efficiency climbed higher with every passing second. He frowned and checked the sensors twice. "That cannot be right," he whispered. Marcus simply listened to the rhythm of the engine with his eyes closed. "It is finally breathing the way it was always meant to." Ethan slowly disconnected the diagnostic cable before stepping back from the car. "Take it easy on the first pass," he said. Marcus nodded once and guided the car toward the beginning of the runway. Hundreds of miles away, performance laboratories filled with multimillion-dollar equipment searched for breakthroughs using powerful computers and expensive simulations. On this forgotten stretch of concrete, one father working from a modest garage had trusted patience, experience, and careful observation instead. Marcus eased onto the throttle, letting the engine build speed naturally. There was no hesitation. No vibración. Every gear change felt effortless, as though the machine itself had been waiting years for someone to understand it. At the far end of the runway, the car disappeared briefly into the afternoon sunlight before turning around for another pass. Ethan looked down at the preliminary data still glowing across the monitor. His pulse quickened. The numbers climbing across the screen were already exceeding factory projections before the real testing had even begun. He looked toward the approaching car and quietly shook his head. "Marcus," he murmured to himself, "what exactly have you built?" Marcus guided the car back to the starting point and climbed out without a trace of celebration. He walked directly to the open hood, listening instead of looking, his fingertips resting lightly against the intake manifold as if greeting an old friend. Ethan hurried toward the diagnostic monitor, refreshing the recorded data again and again because he could not believe what the screen continued to display. Fuel efficiency had improved by nearly 18%. Internal temperatures remained lower than any comparable performance engine in its class. Airflow numbers that should have plateaued continued climbing with astonishing stability. Ethan looked over his shoulder. "These sensors have to be wrong." Marcus calmly wiped his hands with a clean shop towel. "Then check them." Ethan replaced every sensor one by one, recalibrated the monitoring system, and repeated the entire process from the beginning. The afternoon slipped quietly toward evening as another test began. This time Marcus accelerated harder down the runway. The engine responded with effortless confidence, its deep tone remaining smooth from idle through every gear change. There was no hesitation. No rough vibration. Just steady power building with remarkable precision. The silver car disappeared into the distance before returning moments later, rolling to a gentle stop beside the monitoring station. Ethan barely waited for Marcus to switch off the ignition before examining the fresh data. The results matched the first run almost perfectly. If anything, they were even better. He slowly lowered the tablet in disbelief. "This is impossible." Marcus smiled softly.
No.
"It is simply consistent." Ethan laughed under his breath. "You always hated that word." Marcus nodded. People call something impossible when they stop asking better questions. They spent the next several hours making careful adjustments measured in fractions rather than inches. Marcus never chased bigger numbers for the sake of excitement. Every change served reliability before performance. Every improvement had to survive long after applause disappeared. As the sun settled below the horizon, Ethan finally climbed into the driver's seat himself. "My turn," he said. Marcus simply stepped aside. Ethan had spent decades driving championship cars on professional circuits, and very little surprised him anymore. He eased onto the runway with measured confidence before gradually pressing deeper into the accelerator. Within seconds, his expression changed. The car responded almost before he finished each decision, flowing forward with effortless balance instead of raw aggression. When he returned several minutes later, he remained seated behind the steering wheel, staring through the windshield in complete silence. Marcus waited patiently. Ethan eventually looked up with eyes that seemed years younger. "It does not feel faster because it is louder," he said quietly. "It feels faster because everything finally works together." Marcus nodded once. "Exactly." Ethan stepped out of the car and extended his hand. "You did not repair an old engine." Marcus shook his friend's hand without speaking. Ethan continued, "You corrected a mistake that people accepted for 20 years. Before Marcus could answer, Ethan's phone vibrated. A respected automotive journalist had somehow learned that an independent test was taking place at the old airfield and was asking whether rumors of unusual performance data were true. Ethan looked from the message to Marcus. "Someone is already asking questions." Marcus glanced toward the quiet engine resting beneath the open sky. "Then let the numbers answer them." Neither man realized that before sunrise the following morning, those numbers would begin spreading through the automotive world faster than either of them had imagined, and somewhere inside Whitmore Velocity, Claire Whitmore would read a report that made her question everything she thought she knew. Monday morning arrived beneath a clear autumn sky, but inside Whitmore Velocity, the atmosphere felt unusually heavy. Engineers gathered around conference tables covered with performance charts, while large monitors displayed industry news scrolling across the screens. Claire Whitmore stepped into the room carrying a cup of untouched coffee, expecting another routine strategy meeting. Instead, every conversation stopped the moment she entered. Her chief engineer silently handed her a printed report. Across the top, one headline stood out in bold letters: "Independent Prototype Records Historic Efficiency During Closed Airfield Evaluation." Claire scanned the first page with calm confidence, but her expression gradually changed as familiar specifications appeared one after another. Compression ratio, airflow geometry, combustion efficiency. Every figure described the very engine she had dismissed as unsalvageable. "Where did this come from?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one engineer cleared his throat. "The testing was verified by Ethan Walker." The room fell completely silent. Ethan's reputation had been built over 3 decades. He was known for refusing publicity, rejecting exaggerated claims, and walking away from any project that relied more on marketing than engineering. If his name appeared on a technical report, people listened. Claire continued reading. The final page contained one sentence highlighted by the independent review committee. The prototype established new performance benchmarks while maintaining exceptional mechanical stability throughout repeated testing. Claire slowly lowered the report. "Who built it?" Another uncomfortable silence followed before the engineering director answered quietly. "The registration traces back to Marcus Brooks." No one moved. No one looked away. Even the constant humming of computers seemed strangely distant. Claire walked toward the conference room window overlooking the engineering floor below. Marcus's workstation remained empty exactly as he had left it. Every tool neatly arranged. Every drawer closed with quiet precision. She remembered the afternoon she had watched him studying that forgotten engine while everyone else had already moved on. At the time she believed she was protecting the company from wasted effort. Now she was beginning to wonder whether she had confused patience with inefficiency. Meanwhile, several counties away, Marcus opened his garage exactly as he did every morning. He brewed fresh coffee, swept the concrete floor, and prepared breakfast before waking Ava for school. Neither of them had seen the growing attention spreading across automotive websites, engineering forums, and industry newsletters. Marcus remained focused on replacing worn brake pads for a local schoolteacher whose aging sedan needed dependable transportation more than expensive upgrades. Ava looked up from the kitchen table where she was finishing homework. "Dad, your phone has been ringing all morning." Marcus glanced toward the workbench where the device vibrated once again before falling quiet. He smiled gently. "The breaks come first." She laughed because she knew he meant it. An hour later, after the customer safely drove away smiling, Marcus finally picked up the phone. 23 missed calls, 12 voice messages for interview requests, 3 offers from automotive companies. One message from Ethan simply read, "Turn on the television." Marcus reached for the small remote hanging beneath an old cabinet. The local morning news appeared on the screen, showing aerial footage of the abandoned runway where the testing had taken place. A reporter stood beside the silver prototype while a banner stretched across the bottom of the broadcast. Independent test vehicle sets new regional speed benchmark with rebuilt legacy engine. Marcus quietly switched the television off before the interview even began. Ava looked at him with wide eyes. "You did it." Marcus smiled with the same quiet humility she had always known. "No," he said softly. "The engine finally did what it was built to do." Claire Whitmore drove alone that afternoon, leaving behind boardrooms, investors, and polished presentations for a narrow county road that wound through fields turning golden beneath the autumn sun. The address Ethan Walker had quietly sent her led not to a state-of-the-art research facility, but to a modest white house with an aging garage standing open behind it. There were no security gates, no expensive equipment visible from the driveway, only the steady rhythm of a socket wrench, the scent of fresh cut wood drifting from a neighboring yard, and the quiet sound of someone humming an old melody while working. Claire stepped from her car and stopped just outside the garage. Marcus Brooks was replacing the alternator on an elderly pickup belonging to a local farmer who stood nearby holding a paper cup of coffee. They laughed about something simple before Marcus tightened the final bolt, closed the hood, and invited the grateful man to start the engine. Came to life immediately. The farmer smiled, shook Marcus's hand with both of his, and drove away waving through the open window. Only then did Marcus notice Claire standing silently near the entrance. He walked toward her without surprise. "Good afternoon, Claire." She looked around the workshop. Every shelf remained carefully organized. The rebuilt record-setting engine rested quietly beneath a protective cover in one corner. Family photographs still watched over the room from the same wooden wall. Nothing about the place suggested fame or triumph. It simply reflected years of honest work. Claire spoke first. "You knew this would happen." Marcus shook his head gently. "I hoped the engine would finally tell the truth. Everything after that belonged to the truth, not to me." She lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at him. "I came because I owe you an apology." Marcus remained silent. "I thought I was making a responsible business decision," she continued. "Instead, I confused speed with wisdom. I judged the hours you invested instead of understanding what those hours were accomplishing." The quiet between them stretched comfortably rather than awkwardly. Marcus finally spoke. "Leadership is difficult because every decision carries weight." Claire nodded slowly. "That does not excuse mine." She reached into her briefcase and removed a thick folder before placing it on the workbench. "A lifetime engineering contract. Complete authority over our research division. Equity in the company. Anything else you ask for." Marcus glanced at the folder but made no effort to open it. Instead, he walked toward the covered engine and gently rested one hand on the protective cloth. "May I ask you something?" Claire answered immediately. "Anything." Marcus looked directly at her. If the engine had failed, would you still believe I deserved another chance? The question lingered in the quiet. Garage. Claire did not answer quickly. She thought about the engineers she had overlooked, the ideas dismissed because they required patience instead of immediate results, and the man standing before her who had never raised his voice even after losing his job. Finally she said, "Yes, because I finally understand that character is measured long before success arrives." Marcus smiled warmly for the first time since she had entered the garage. He closed the folder without reading a single page. Then perhaps that is the real breakthrough. At that moment Ava returned home from school carrying her backpack. She froze briefly after recognizing Claire from the company photographs she had once seen in her father's office. Marcus introduced them with the same kindness he showed every customer who crossed his driveway. Watching father and daughter exchange easy smiles, Claire realized the greatest thing Marcus had built had never been an engine. It was the quiet life that success had never managed to change. 1 week later, the same abandoned runway welcomed a very different gathering. Engineers, journalists, university researchers, and veteran mechanics stood quietly behind the safety barriers. Not because a corporation had purchased attention, but because a remarkable set of numbers had earned their respect. The rebuilt engine rested beneath the hood of the silver prototype exactly as Marcus had assembled it in his small garage. There were no dramatic speeches before the demonstration. No oversized banners. No promises of revolution. Only honest work waiting to speak for itself. Claire Whitmore stood beside Ethan Walker near the starting line, her hands folded calmly as she watched Marcus complete one final inspection. He tightened a single fitting, wiped away an invisible fingerprint from the valve cover, and stepped back with quiet satisfaction. Ava smiled from the front row, holding the same handwritten note she had given her father days earlier. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat, while Ethan raised one hand to signal the official start. The engine awakened with its familiar steady rhythm, smooth and confident, carrying none of the strain people expected from record-breaking machinery. As the prototype accelerated down the runway, conversations slowly disappeared. Every observer watched in complete silence while the car gathered speed with remarkable composure before disappearing toward the far end of the pavement. Seconds later, it returned just as effortlessly, crossing the timing markers with a new verified benchmark that exceeded every previous independent record for that engine platform. No one cheered immediately. Instead, a quiet stillness settled across the airfield as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Then, almost naturally, applause began from a single retired mechanic standing near the fence. Others joined him until the entire runway echoed with appreciation rather than excitement. Claire walked toward Marcus as he stepped from the car. She did not speak right away. She simply extended the engineering contract one final time. Marcus looked at the folder before gently handing it back unopened. "I will help," he said with a warm smile. "But only if every engineer in your company is given enough time to finish asking the right questions before someone decides they are wasting it." Claire nodded without hesitation. "That will be the first policy we change." Months later, Whitmore Velocity introduced a new research program built around patience, craftsmanship, and long-term innovation. Employees quietly referred to it as the Brooks Principle. Marcus never asked for the name, and he never accepted an executive office. He continued working from the same modest garage, teaching young engineers, helping neighbors keep old trucks on the road, and reminding Ava that greatness was rarely loud. Every now and then she would find him resting one hand on the rebuilt engine with the same peaceful smile he wore the day he first saw its hidden potential. She finally understood what her father had always known. The fastest machine in the world begins with the slowest virtue of all. Someone willing to believe before everyone else does.